Good evening, everyone. I'm Jo Fox. I'm the Dean of the School of Advanced Study, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural National Humanities Lecture here at the University of London. This is the first of a brand new series of annual lectures led by the school, a national centre for the humanities funded by Research England and the University of London. Our aim this evening is to celebrate the vital role of the humanities in public life. We've chosen this year, the year of our 30th anniversary, to make this positive intervention in surfacing how humanities change, shape, and influence our way of life. And it's an important time to do this, at a time of fracture, challenge, shifting global politics, increasing inequalities. At a time when the relevance of our work is sometimes questioned, but also at a time when public interest in the humanities have never been greater. We actually have nearly 1,000 people joining us this evening here in London, in this room, and also online around the world. And that in itself is a powerful indicator of the continued support for and interest in the humanities. It's also a testament to our inaugural lecturers' enormous influence and impact upon public life. Professor David Olusoga has demonstrated the power of the humanities to challenge, to reflect, to inspire, and most importantly, to affect change. He has had a significant influence on critical evaluations about who we are, our shared stories, our divided pasts. At a time of increased political and cultural polarization, he has exemplified how deep understanding, civil debate, and civic purpose can lead to better outcomes for society, and in doing so, demonstrate the power of the humanities, not just by saying, but by doing. In so many ways, David has been the UK's foremost ambassador for the humanities. Speaking of our own National Being Human Festival, he said, "The humanities get a bad press. People, often people who should know better, can dismiss them as irrelevant, elitist, distant from the real world. Festivals like Being Human are important because they help to demonstrate why this isn't true. They show how history shapes the world we live in today, how languages, cultures, and ideas mold our politics and can change the world for the better." Nowhere is this more keenly expressed as through David's tireless work in support of these aims. To have a scholar of such extraordinary distinction and widespread acclaim as our inaugural lecturer is a privilege, and a testament to the ambition and importance of the work that we do across our disciplines. I'll now hand over to Professor Sarah Churchwell, our Chair in Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Study, to introduce the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As Jo has said, we are extremely excited here at the school to welcome you to the inaugural National Humanities Lecture. We really believe this is a landmark event, and it is dedicated to exploring the profound role of the arts and humanities in shaping our world. This will be an annual lecture, and we will invite every year a leading figure from the humanities to examine pressing social and cultural questions through the unique perspectives afforded by humanities disciplines. The lecture stands as both a celebration of the richness and insight that the humanities bring to public life, and as a powerful reminder of their enduring significance in society. This lecture forms part of a broader commitment to public humanities here at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. It is an approach that affirms the distinctive power of the humanities, not only as fields of academic inquiry, but as essential frameworks for understanding and engaging with the complexities of contemporary life. And as we have been talking more and more about public humanities, I have been increasingly hearing from people who respond to the idea of public humanities by saying, well, what would a private humanities look like anyway? And it seems to me that it's with that spirit that we are approaching the humanities here, as something that is definitionally for the public, by the public, with the public. In an era marked by the climate crisis, threats to democracy, and the rapid transformations of technology, it has never been more urgent to align humanities research with public concerns, fostering dialogue that bridges divides, promotes social justice, and addresses the defining challenges of our time. This annual lecture will offer an opportunity for individuals across disciplines, sectors, and backgrounds to come together in a shared commitment to understanding, dialogue, and discovery, affirming the vital role of the humanities in shaping a more just, thoughtful, and connected world. Tonight's event marks not just a celebration of ideas, but the launch of an exciting new initiative, the Public Humanities Fellowship here at SAS. This fellowship recognizes and supports leading individuals within and beyond the academy who are shaping the future of public humanities, deepening its reach, and expanding its impact. Public humanities thrive on collaboration, on breaking down barriers between scholarship and society. Our inaugural fellows embody this ethos, working across disciplines to bring humanities research into public life in new and transformative ways. We are honored to welcome our first National Humanities Lecturer, Professor David Olusoga, as an inaugural Public Humanities Fellow, alongside 4 other distinguished figures whose work has already shaped public understanding in myriad ways. In alphabetical order, they are Professor Karenza Lewis, University of Lincoln, archaeologist and broadcaster, whose pioneering work, from TV's Time Team to award-winning research, has made history and landscape archaeology accessible to all. Dr. Adam Rutherford, University College London, geneticist and broadcaster, whose work bridges science and society, illuminating the intersections of genetics, race, and identity. Professor Lindsay Stonebridge, University of Birmingham, scholar of literature and human rights, whose writing and broadcasting interrogate history, politics, and moral responsibility in a turbulent world. And Erica Wagner, Goldsmiths, University of London, journalist, author, and critic, former literary editor of The Times, whose keen insights into literature and culture have shaped public discourse on both sides of the Atlantic. Together, these fellows will champion the public humanities abroad and here at SAS, not only through their own work, but by fostering new dialogues and new ways of thinking. They will help us shape the field's future, exploring its ethical, intellectual, and creative dimensions at a time when its contributions to public life have never been more vital. The Public Humanities Fellowship is more than a title. It is a commitment to broadening and reimagining how humanities research engages with the world. We're delighted to continue this journey with such an extraordinary group. I'm going to say just a few more words about David. He is the classic example of not needing any introduction, and yet we are going to introduce him. And I'm going to continue Joe's introduction because, as I don't have to tell you, Professor David Olusoga is one of the most influential public historians of our time. As an award-winning broadcaster, filmmaker, and author, he has reshaped how history is understood, written, and broadcast. As professor of public history at the University of Manchester, he brings rigorous scholarship to extensive audiences, making history urgent, accessible, and deeply relevant. On screen, his storytelling is powerful and transformative. He presents the long-running BBC history series A House Through Time, and wrote and presented the BAFTA-winning Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. His other notable works include Black and British: A Forgotten History, which was awarded the Longman History Today Trustees Award and the Penn Hessel-Tittman Prize, and The World's War, which won First World War Book of the Year. In recognition of his outstanding contributions, he was honored with the BAFTA Special Award. A prolific journalist, he is also deeply committed to public engagement, having worked with institutions such as the National Trust, the British Museum, and The Guardian, helping to shape conversations on history, memory, and cultural heritage in public life. His work compels us to see history in its full complexity, to acknowledge both its triumphs and its deep injustices, and to recognize its ongoing impact on the present. We are truly honored to have him with us this evening, and I am hugely looking forward to this, our first inaugural National Humanities Lecture. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor David Olusoga.
Thank you. Thank you. Two introductions. I'm doubly fortunate. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm humbled to have been asked to give this first lecture and to do so in the presence of so many scholars and writers whose work I so admire. And thanks especially to my friend, Professor Sarah Churchwell. Let's begin not with a celebration, but with a recognition that things in some ways aren't great. Last week, as you will have seen, was a bad week for higher education. There are more bad weeks ahead. But repeatedly, over recent years, a disproportionate amount of the bad news has landed on the desks of those who teach and administer in the humanities. Last November, for example, Canterbury Christ Church University announced the closure of its English literature degree course. The irony of that decision, pointed out by numerous people at the time, is that the closure means it will soon no longer be possible to study English literature in the city in which Aphra Behn and Christopher Marlowe were born, the city to which Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrims trudged in the Canterbury Tales. The wider crisis in university funding is, of course, partly to blame. And some of the degree courses that have recently closed have been science courses, with chemistry seeing especially steep declines. And the decline in humanities degree courses is in some cases reflective of the choices being made by young people when choosing their A-levels, who at times are choosing to walk away from the humanities for a range of reasons. But there is so often a notable difference in responses and reactions, particularly among journalists and politicians, to the closure of humanities courses. While some sciences are facing challenges of their own, they are rarely in the same ways as the humanities expected to justify their relevance or make a utilitarian case for their very existence. In an essay written in 2020, the scholar Judith Butler warned of the dangers of the current direction of travel, imagining a possible future in which, quote, the humanities will become occasional ornaments for curricula based more profitably in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and maths. In the time that I've got with you this evening, I hope to do two things. Firstly, I want to make a case for the humanities, not just in higher education, but particularly the public humanities and particularly public history. And I want to discuss the role of public history in part by talking about my own career, my own experiences, the work that I do, and also why I do it. And secondly, I want to talk about the ways in which humanities, despite being often minimized and misrepresented, have an impact and a relevance that is obvious, socially vital, if underreported and underappreciated. And I'd like to touch upon the ways in which public humanities are finding new and greater significance, new cultural, economic, and societal functions, adapting to new technologies, speaking to neglected communities and to new generations who consume information in new ways, sometimes radically new ways. But I'm a public historian because long before I understood the definition of public history or public humanities, I just knew that I wanted to engage in history as a public practice and not exclusively as an academic discipline. At the age of 25, the pathway to becoming an academic historian suddenly opened up ahead of me, to my surprise. I'd presumed that that traditional pathway was closed because my family didn't have the money to fund it. But when funding was made available, to my shock, when that impediment was removed, I realized that this was not a path I actually wanted to walk down. What I wanted to do was acquire new skills. I really wanted to travel. I wanted to leave the world of education, but I desperately wanted to keep working in history, the subject I'd loved since my early teens. Part of this decision, made at the age of 25, was a determination. I think I had a rather windswept and interesting view of myself as a 25-year-old. A determination to avoid ending up a greying middle-aged history professor giving long lectures in a suit and tie. As attempts to escape destiny go, it's not been exactly flawless. An almost Oedipus level of failure to avoid destiny. I wanted to leave education, but I didn't want to leave history. What I wanted to do was to try to make history in the ways that I'd encountered it as a child that had made me fall in love with history, which was watching it on television. Because back when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, back when the BBC was relatively far better funded, before the cuts of the past 14 years, back when history documentaries were a much bigger part of the schedule, both on the BBC and on commercial television, history was just enrapturing to me. It was watching Michael Wood shine a light into the shadows of the so-called Dark Ages that made me appreciate the antiquity of the nation I was growing up in. And it was watching television on history that alerted me to what Trevelyan called the poetry of history, the aspects of history that are, as he said, quasi-miraculous. It was watching in 1986 an art history series called Artists and Models that made all my mother's earlier desperate efforts to open her children's eyes to art, it made them suddenly make sense. The summers of being dragged around the National Gallery and the Tate all clicked into place because of 3 hours on BBC Two, 3 hours of the very best drama documentary that perhaps the BBC has ever produced, that set the lives and the talents of Jacques-Louis David, of Jean-Auguste Ongue and Theodore Géricault into the tumultuous contexts of the decades through which they lived. The moment I'd earned a little money working in shops and bars, I found myself traveling around Europe, visiting the Louvre, the Prado, the Rijksmuseum, to see the paintings I'd been introduced to on television. It was public history, public arts, public humanities, documentaries that gave me the passions that have been with me for the rest of my life. And my access to the humanities, through television, through free-to-access museums, through a library that was literally opposite my teenage home, all of that relied on a complex network of grants and subsidies that was entirely invisible to me. But if there was one moment when I became hooked, when it became clear to me that I just needed to engage in history as a public practice, that moment was 9:30 p.m. on the 12th of January, 1991. It was when I watched a one-off BBC documentary, what Americans would call a special. And it was another drama documentary. It's hardly remembered today. It was called The War That Never Ends. It was, I think, one of the highest moments in the history of the BBC. It was the idea of the producer Michael Cousteau and John Barton, who was the associate director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, both sadly now passed. And their concept was not new, but it was brilliant. Cousteau, whose wife was Greek, had then been rereading Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars in the months leading up to what we then called the Gulf War, what we now sadly call the First Gulf War. When Cousteau picked up his old copy of Penguin classic version of Thucydides, he saw the obvious parallels between the war fought between Athens and Sparta and their allies in the 5th century and the then gathering storm in the Middle East. Now, this was not a new idea, because back in 1965, passages from Thucydides had been formed on stage in New York alongside a dramatization of the US Senate committee hearings into the Vietnam War. Indeed, much of the enduring power of Thucydides' work is that it speaks to every age. It was exactly that timelessness that made The War That Never Ends so special, to me at least. On the news bulletins on the 12th of January 1991 that preceded this broadcast, there were reports of the day's events. Both houses of the US Congress had passed resolutions permitting the use of military force in Iraq. The United Nations General Secretary had met with Saddam Hussein in a last-ditch attempt to avoid war, as had the Soviet Special Envoy. And that evening, as the BBC broadcast The War That Never Ends, over 500,000 coalition troops were in their positions along the border of Kuwait. It was in that atmosphere on that evening that 1 million people listened to the orations of Pericles, performed by Ben Kingsley, the reasoning of Socrates, played by Don Henderson. They listened to the words of the Athenian envoys and the cold conclusions of the Melian dialogue. They heard Thucydides' own views on human nature. And as the credits rolled, the soundtrack was a cacophony of voices, not from ancient Greece, but the voices of the politicians, the envoys, the generals, and the diplomats of 1991. The same voices that appeared earlier in the evening on the news, in the news bulletins, and over the previous 7 months as the Kuwait crisis trundled towards war. I was in my first year studying history at university, and that evening, the astonishing, humbling power of public history was broadcast into my student room with greater clarity than ever before. Everything clicked. And 3 nights later, the war began, perhaps vindicating Thucydides' views about the unchangeability of mankind. When I joined the BBC at the age of 27, and I discovered I could call up any programme that had ever been broadcast, apart from all the ones that had been lost or misfiled, The War That Never Ends was the first thing that I watched. It is now, thankfully, on YouTube, if you're interested. It is just amazing. Things fell even more clearly into place when I discovered later that year, as part of my studies, that Thucydides had written his History of the Peloponnesian War, expecting it not to be read, but for it to be read out loud and performed. His audiences were not predominantly readers, unlike undergraduates, poring over his words in solitude. The history of the Peloponnesian Wars was innately public history. And at its heart are the great passages of debate, rhetoric, and oration, which partly explain why Thucydides' words, when handed to a brilliant cast of actors by the BBC in 1991 and in New York in 1965, require so little adaptation and are so instantly impactful. So the scholarly instinct that history is something that is fundamentally, perhaps even at times, thought to be exclusively written, is not a view that Thucydides, or even more so, Herodotus, would have recognised. That astonishing BBC programme, along with the programmes I'd watched as a child, convinced me of the same, that history can be performed as well as written, that it can thrive on the screen and on the stage as well as on the page, that it can remain truthful to all of the traditions and conventions that I was at that moment being acculturated into as a history undergraduate, but the different branches of the tree of history could balance one another out. That love of history on TV, that belief in public history, was what lay behind my ultimately failed bid as a 25-year-old to escape my destiny and not be standing here before you this evening as a greying middle-aged history professor giving a lecture in a suit and tie. It's perhaps because the value of public history was, for some reason, just so axiomatic to me when I was relatively young that I've always struggled to understand the way in which public histories and public humanities are required constantly to make and remake the case and justify their value. Here in the UK, some of the suspicion of the humanities is framed as a perfectly reasonable sounding assertion that rounded individuals and prospective professionals need a rounded education, and that our system forces people when too young to specialise, as I think it does. However, it always seems to be the case when these arguments are made that the subjects that young people should be doing less of and universities should be teaching less are the humanities. And when strategies are adopted by policymakers to encourage this broader education, the results can at times be ridiculous, as I think my own case shows. In order to teach history in a maintained primary school, secondary school, or special school in England, teachers need to have qualified teacher status, a qualification acquired through teacher training. So far, so obvious. However, candidates seeking a place on a teacher training course in England need a bachelor's degree in any subject, but they also need GCSE grade 4 or above in both English and maths. Sounds reasonable in theory. But I don't have GCSE maths. Irrespective of what other qualifications I might acquire, that means I'm not eligible to teach history in a British classroom. And I should stress my lack of maths is not for want of trying. I have the distinction of failing GCSE maths on 4 occasions. After the first, second, and third failures, my mother, using money she didn't have, rushed out to sign me up for resits that I would then promptly fail. When the grade on my 4th attempt was lower than on my 3rd attempt, no further resits were booked, and my mother never spoke of it again. But the result of this inflexible criteria imposed from the top down means that I'm in the ridiculous position of having written history books for children that are used in classrooms and having published history lesson plans which are used in schools, around which some schools have built parts of their curricula, but not being qualified to teach my own books and my own lesson plans in the classroom. The suspicion, at times the hostility shown towards the humanities subjects, it clashes with the often unacknowledged, unrecognized enthusiasm for the humanities in everyday life. The importance of the role public historians play in our current moment of disorientation and discord, it's more clear than ever. The significance of their role is being made more clear with each passing day. The millions who look to Timothy Snyder, a historian who has convinced so many people to hold faith during the political and military crisis in Europe and in the United States. They might not think that they're engaging in public history, but they are eager consumers of it. While much of the news media appears, I'm afraid, to be normalizing, almost unthinkingly, the breakdown of accepted political and democratic standards, it is historians like Timothy Snyder who sometimes on a real-time, almost day-to-day basis speak to mass audiences who are eager for historical context and comparison, who understand that without history, at this moment of all moments, we cannot even begin to understand the events that we are living through. Something is similarly true for Heather Cox Richardson, Professor of History at Boston College, the author of 7 books, but a part of the lives of millions of people through her brilliant Letters from an American, a newsletter. And there is my friend Mary Beard, who last month again demonstrated the utility of public historians. Mary is the historian who brought Roman history to mass audiences, who single-handedly revitalized the Italian tourist industry. She was thankfully on hand to dismiss claims last month that a certain hand gesture was in fact Roman and therefore there was nothing to worry about. But public history is more than the work of those brilliant, notable public historians. As Raphael Samuel wrote back in 1994 in Theatre of Memories, Past and Present in Contemporary Culture, if history was thought of as an activity rather than a profession, then its practitioners would become legion. Over the 3 decades since Samuel explored the distinctions and the overlaps between academic history and public history and called for a broader understanding of the wider history ecosystem, the range of practitioners has expanded even further. Perhaps the biggest single expansion of public history has been the revolution in popular participatory genealogy. The growth of genealogy research is visible not just in the numbers of people engaged in building family trees, in disentombing documents linked to the lives of their ancestors, but in the scale and proliferation of companies and services that have sprung up to assist them. The global genealogy services and products market was valued in 2023 at $5.4 billion. It is projected to reach $8 billion next year and $15.8 billion by 2033. The companies at the forefront of this, Find My Past, Ancestry, and others, have become household brands. These services allow their users to build family trees, to search newspapers as well as official documents for details of the lives of their ancestors. According to some sources, genealogy websites have become the second most visited type of website on the web after pornography. And genealogy is said to be the second most popular hobby in the United States after gardening. Gardening pornography, that is, obviously. A flourishing in one part of the history ecosystem can feed through into another. The BBC's Who Do You Think You Are, for all its flaws and exaggerations. If Adam Rutherford is here, he can explain to you in detail what those flaws and exaggerations are. It's been the most popular history series on television for a decade. And it taps into an audience that is now familiar and comfortable with historical documents because, in large part, of the genealogy revolution, which has been part of the experiences of literally millions of families. The mindset of those who made television, until Who Do You Think You Are, held that documents lacked the visual impact to be of any real use in television history storytelling. As a young producer, every attempt to film in the archives or to film with documents was overruled by my bosses. And at some point in every discussion, well, really argument about this, pejoratives were used to describe documents. Documents were always either dry, dusty, old, or boring. But thanks to Who Do You Think You Are and its American equivalent, Finding Your Roots, that prejudice has partially evaporated. Audiences far larger than those typically drawn to the once fashionable drama documentaries. Audiences larger in some cases than those drawn to actual historical dramas with budgets of millions of dollars an episode. Audiences larger than that watch Who Do You Think You Are? And they are gripped as obscure documents, as census records and birth certificates from unfamiliar archives are presented and decoded by academic historians because they contain details that bring the humanity of history into the lives of household name celebrities, sometimes bringing those celebrities to tears or to incredulity. The power of documents. It's demonstrated 10 times a year on BBC One. That one television show both tapped into the genealogy revolution and it freed television from one of its worst blinding prejudices against the materiality of history and the contents of the archives. Thanks to Who Do You Think You Are, program makers are free to use documents to tell stories. And audiences are able to experience something like those rare moments that every historian has experienced and treasures, usually just a few times in a career. When a box of documents arrives on a trolley, or a page is turned, and an individual from the past emerges, or a detail is disentombed, or a piece of evidence that makes sense of a previous document falls into place, and you feel something of the quasi-miraculous fact of history. A television series that I present, that was mentioned earlier, A House Through Time, has played a small role in the expanding scope of participatory public history. After each series of A House Through Time, we've received letters from archivists telling us of an uptick in footfall and activity and engagement as people inspired by the series turn themselves into amateur house historians. The biggest upticks take place in the cities in which the series have been filmed. Often a house history is the next project that people take on after years of genealogical study and investigation. I get sent letters all the time of people who've discovered details about their homes. I get sent privately published books from people who've done so much research that they've brought it into the form of a book and published it and distributed it around their family, and they just want someone to see it. Sometimes they describe being just empowered to see their homes in new ways, the most familiar places in their lives given totally new meanings. They discover in the archives information that explains the features of their house, the layout of their house, or equally, they uncover tragedies in the lives of those who lived, and in some cases, who died in the rooms in which they now live. And like the viewers of Who Do You Think You Are, they experience that rush of connection, that humanity of history, through the archives or through the built environment. They do that magical thing and encounter as another human being with a person who lived or died before your birth. Genealogy, house histories, pop-up museums, street history projects, school history projects, personal, family, private or local investigations have made historians out of literally millions of people, and some have become not just historians but public historians. Using TikTok or YouTube or other social media platforms, they generate clips. Sometimes they generate whole programs about subjects that they desperately care about. There is a new world of hyper-specialization within this new arena of public history, and it is just breathtaking. I'm currently writing a stage show about the social history of the machine gun, a show that involves using historic antique weapons as storytelling props. And thanks to the films posted on YouTube by the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association, I now have learned how to disassemble and reassemble a 1942 Vickers Maxim machine gun. Or to be honest, I've now learned that disassembling and reassembling a 1942 machine gun is completely beyond me, and I'm never, under any circumstances, going to even attempt it. But public history is just, it's expanding. It's being democratized by new technology. The same platforms that provide the great academic historians like Timothy Snyder, Heather Cox Richardson, and Mary Beard with new audiences, new ways of also being public historians. They are also the platforms that are making public historians of so many people. But public history is also, it's Hamilton. It's a rap opera based on the scholarly biography of a founding father. It's the 2-hour-long history podcasts listened to eagerly by members of generations whom we're told will only engage with a 60-second TikTok clip. Public history is this month's release on Disney Plus of 1,000 Blows, a drama series written by Stephen Knight that imagines the lives of real historical figures from the underworld of late Victorian London, a show that both myself and the brilliant writer and historian Hallie Rubinold have worked on. And public history is more public than ever, not simply because of new technologies and new outlets, but because its democratization has made it more inclusive. When I first started writing and making TV programs about Black British history, I thought I understood how deeply that community felt the pain of erasure, the pain of its absence, of its histories, its ancestors, in the history that was taught in school and the history that appeared in books and on television programs. I took my work seriously, my partner might say obsessively and fanatically, because I felt that burden of responsibility to address that absence and to use my skills and my skill set as a historian, a journalist and a producer to drag those neglected histories into the mainstream. I now realize I totally underestimated the hunger that existed for a more inclusive, more expansive history. I am constantly humbled by the power of the medium in which I'm privileged to work, but also just by the power of the humanities, their capacity for bringing people together, not just communities today, but people from the past and people living today, their capacity to bring marginalized histories to large audiences, and what that means for people who stop me in the streets to talk about a program I can barely remember that I made 10 years ago, but they still remember and they still think about. When constantly under attack, as so many historians, both in the academy and in public eye are, it is easy to focus on the criticism and to fight against misrepresentation. It is easy to find yourself in a siege mentality. But we also need to remember and to celebrate the positive everyday impact of public history and public humanities. In my inaugural lecture at the University of Manchester 5 years ago, I described my role, searching for a metaphor, as being akin to that of a piece of connective circuitry that links the knowledge production within the academy with the public conversation. I'm not sure how effective I've been, but I'd like to finish by talking about the project that I think has achieved that. The project I am most proud of in my whole career, although almost no one knows I had anything to do with it because I didn't present it. It's not a book with my name on the cover. I'm one of those little names at the end when you're getting up making a cup of tea that no one takes any notice of. But it's a project that still leaves me astonished and humbled by the power of the humanities. The story begins back in 2013. I was at home in my office reading an astonishing academic paper written by the brilliant Professor Michel Barrett, then of Queen Mary, University of London. Michel, using documents from the archives of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and other sources, had demonstrated that in the 1920s, the Commission had failed to live up to its founding principles. Beyond the Western Front, in Africa and the Middle East, black and brown men who had fought or laboured for the British Empire had been treated differently in death to their white comrades. Although these men had fallen in the same theatres, in the same conflict, they, unlike their white comrades, had been denied what Kipling called the dignity of a known and honoured grave. Some had been left in unmarked graves, or even in mass graves, on the edges of forgotten battlefields, or on the sites of temporary hospitals. Many hundreds of them are buried under what is now a bus station in the city of Mombasa. These men, at least 100,000 of them, subjects and soldiers or auxiliaries of the British Empire, had been treated in death as they had been treated so often in life, as second-class citizens in a racialized empire. And the Imperial War Graves Commission, as it was then, along with various colonial governors and politicians, had justified the unequal commemoration by pointing out the huge logistical challenges of locating and exhuming the bodies and the vast costs of doing so. They made these arguments in the same years that the Commission was spending huge sums creating the vast cemeteries of the former Western Front and gathering thousands of bodies from the dangerous munition-stream battlefields of Flanders, as if that immense task involved no logistical challenges and incurred no expense. At times, as Michel's work showed, those in power had argued that the African societies from which these soldiers and auxiliaries had been drawn, in some cases forcibly recruited, that those societies were not civilized enough to appreciate graves in cemeteries or headstones through which to remember their sons and husbands. The language the Commission used in those years was that their remains should be allowed to, quote, revert to nature. Michel's paper was already almost a decade old when I read it, and yet historical facts as incendiary as that, a scandal involving one of the most revered and respected, rightly revered and respected national institutions, had just not become public knowledge. The publication, Professor Barrett's paper, in an academic journal had not become front-page news. And because it had garnered so little attention, the Commission had not felt compelled to act upon her research. And disconnects like this between what scholars uncover and what becomes part of public debate and public history are not unusual. Academic books, academic papers can and do almost lie dormant, almost chemically inert, which of course is why public history and public humanities are needed. After reading Professor Barrett's paper, I did what historians do. I cited her findings in the footnotes of a book I was writing on the First World War that was published a year later. But because I'm a public historian, because I work as a TV producer and a journalist, I also arranged to meet Professor Barrett. We became friends, and for 5 years, we tried to persuade TV commissioners that what she had discovered, the documents she'd revealed, as seemed obvious to both of us, were a huge national scandal that, if presented skillfully to the public, would combust, that might even if we were really fortunate, bring about change. Finally, in 2019, having utterly failed to use the centenary anniversary of the war as a hook for commission, we persuaded Channel 4 to finally let us make a documentary, and my friend David Lammy agreed to present the film. That documentary, The Unremembered, aired on Channel 4. It presented the exact same evidence that Professor Barrett had presented in her academic paper back in 2007. It began in one of the first locations she'd visited. It quoted from people that she'd met on her research trips. There was nothing in it that was not in that academic paper. But this documentary set in train a series of events that, thanks to the ceaseless campaigning of David Lammy and Professor Barrett, who discovered they were quite a good team together, they forced the Commission to appoint a special committee to investigate the evidence that they had refused to investigate and to draft a report into what had happened in the 1920s. That report, published in 2021, contains admissions by the Commission that what lay behind this historic betrayal of African and Indian soldiers and labourers were, quote, entrenched prejudices, preconceptions and pervasive racism of contemporary imperial attitudes. Their words, not mine. I realise it does sound like me, but it's for once not. In Parliament, the then Defence Minister, Ben Wallace, issued an apology on behalf of the Commission and the government for what he called the Commission's failure to live up to their founding principles. He went on to express deep regret that it has taken so long to rectify the situation. All of this, statements in Parliament, official reports, because an academic paper, a brilliant, tenacious piece of scholarship, achieved a sort of cultural fission when it became public history. When different branches of the history ecosystem came together, it was Michelle's scholarship, her time in the archives, her dedication, her refusal to be diverted or mollified by the Commission that lay at the heart of the documentary. But it was the fact that it became a documentary, a work of public history, that brought about change. The Commission had closed its eyes. They'd hoped they could ignore a single academic and a single academic paper in an academic journal. The leadership of the Commission had presumed that Michelle, who had learnt this terrible chapter, would never be able to build a platform from which to broadcast her findings, that her work would continue to lie dormant and inert. 5 years later, and now under a new director, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is 4 years into a project to uncover records that under the previous administration, the Commission had assured Michelle had been lost, destroyed, or could never be located. Last year, that new director sent me a link to a short film that they'd made, which is on YouTube. Its central protagonist is a very elderly Kenyan woman called Esther. During the Second World War, Esther's young husband, Mutava Ingati, was conscripted into the British Army. They had been married for 2 months. He never came back, and no information was ever made available to her or to her family, or to his family, as to what had happened to him. The project launched by the Commission in the aftermath of the documentary, the report and the apology uncovered and is uncovering vast amounts of information, locating thousands of new documents. And in the short film I was sent, Patrick Abungu, a Kenyan field investigator, an astonishing man whose own ancestors were forcibly conscripted in the First World War, who leads this project, was able to reveal to Esther that Mutava had died in India in 1945. He was able to reveal to her that his body lies in a Commonwealth War Graves Commission grave in Calcutta. 80 years after her husband had left, she was finally given this piece of information. Esther asked that the Commission add an inscription from her to her husband's grave on the other side of the Indian Ocean. This happened because of the brilliant work of Patrick Abungu and the Commission in Kenya. It happened because of groundbreaking archival research carried out by Professor Michelle Barrett. It happened because of the campaigning of David Lammy. But the catalyst for all of this was a work of public history. When I'm tired, when I've been dumb enough to look and see what people are saying about me on Twitter, when I ask myself, why am I doing this? I think about Esther, her children, and her grandchildren. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So much.
You're not blubbering, are you?
Thank you, David. There are so many in this room this evening and joining us online who needed to hear that. And it is such a powerful call to all of us to make use of history, the humanities, and the power for the humanities to change. I can't thank you enough. That was so very needed among all of our communities and indeed all of those we serve. So thank you. And thank you to all of you joining us here this evening. It's really important to us that you're here. It's such an important topic. Thank you for those of you joining us online. And for those of you here with us in London, we'll invite you to carry on the conversations over some refreshments. But if you join me once again for thanking David for such a fantastic lecture.